When the Iron Curtain of World War II finally closed, history was written by the victors. And in the skies, one victor had an indisputable name, the B-29 Superfortress. A flying fortress, a metal monster that became the pinnacle of aeronautical engineering of its time. It was the one that brought the war to the most remote islands of Japan. It was the one that, in two dark and definitive missions, reshaped the concept of power and destruction by dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The B-29 is not just an airplane, it is an icon, an indelible symbol of the end of one era and the beginning of another, the atomic age. But what if I told you that this story, like so many others, has a B-side, a chapter almost ripped from the official record? What if I told you that while the B-29 reaped glory and dread, another giant, even more advanced in certain aspects, was being prepared to take its place? It was designed to be its successor, a machine born of the same desperate need for air supremacy, but which, through a cruel combination of fate, bureaucracy, and timing, ended up relegated to the shadows. A ghost that flew real missions, fought, and bled in the last gasps of war, only to be completely erased from collective memory. This is not a fictional tale. It is the true and tragic story of the consolidated B-32 Dominator, the lost brother of the B-29, an aircraft that promised to dominate the skies, but was born in the twilight of a world at war, too late for glory and too soon for peace. Today, we will unearth the wreckage of this story. We will delve into the secret quarters of the Pentagon, the feverish assembly lines of California, and the hostile skies of the Pacific to understand how such an ambitious project could simply disappear. Brace yourself, because this is the story of the bomber that never was. To understand the birth of the B-32, we must return to a time of panic and uncertainty, 1939 and 1940. Europe was being engulfed by the Nazi war machine. France, considered a military power, capitulated within weeks. England, isolated on its island, fought for its survival in the skies over London. In the Pacific, the Empire of Japan expanded its influence with terrifying speed, leaving a trail of conquest and brutality in its wake. For the United States, neutrality was an increasingly fragile position. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Air Forces, looked at the world map and saw a logistical nightmare. If England fell, the United States would have no forward base in Europe from which to launch an aerial counterattack against the heart of Germany. America could find itself completely isolated, forced to fight a war thousands of miles away, crossing entire oceans. The existing bomber fleet, consisting of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, was formidable but insufficient. They were strategic bombers, but not intercontinental bombers. They lacked the range, service ceiling, or payload capacity to accomplish the mission Hap Arnold envisioned. It was in this urgent context that on January 29, 1940, an audacious, almost futuristic request was born, known as the Request for Data R-40B. The specifications were breathtaking for the technology of the time. A heavy bomber with a top speed of 400 miles per hour, a range of over 5,300 miles, and the capacity to carry 2,000 pounds of bombs half that distance. And most importantly, it would have to operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet, where enemy fighters and anti-aircraft artillery would have difficulty reaching it. To achieve this, the crew cabin would have to be pressurized, a technological luxury almost out of science fiction. 4 major manufacturers responded to the call: Boeing, Lockheed, Douglas, and Consolidated Aircraft. But the project was so vital, so critical to future American war strategy, the Army decided not to bet all its chips on a single horse. It was a strategic insurance policy. They selected two finalists to develop prototypes in parallel. It was a direct competition, a race against time and technology. On one side, Boeing with its bold Model 345, which would later be immortalized as the B-29 Superfortress. On the other, San Diego-based Consolidated Aircraft, which had already proven its worth with the rugged and reliable B-24 Liberator. Consolidated presented its Model 33, a design that promised to be a natural evolution, even more powerful and imposing. This design would receive the military designation XB-32. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. May the best man win. Or, in the worst-case scenario, if one design failed catastrophically, the other would be ready to take over. What no one imagined was that this competition would not be decided solely by engineering, but by the military calendar itself: war.
Consolidated's project, the Future Dominator, began with a different philosophy than Boeing's. While the B-29 was a revolution, an aircraft that rewrote the rules with its radical innovations, the B-32 was conceived as an evolution. Consolidated wanted to take what already worked in its B-24 Liberator and push it to the extreme. The first striking feature of the XB-32 prototype was its wing. Like the B-24, it utilized the so-called Davis wing, a very thick, high-lift aerodynamic profile that was excellent for carrying heavy loads over long distances. It was a commitment to robustness. Another legacy of the B-24 was the initial tail design with a double vertical stabilizer. It was believed that this would offer greater stability and control for an aircraft of that size. At the heart of the machine was the same raw power that would power its rival: four 18-cylinder Wright 3350 duplex cyclone radial engines, each capable of generating more than 2,200 horsepower. These were the most powerful engines available at the time, veritable powerhouses that would transform these giants into flying fortresses. On paper, the B-32 held bold promises. Consolidated planned a state-of-the-art defensive system with retractable, remotely controlled turrets operated by gunners from pressurized gun points. The idea was to create a protective sphere for .5 caliber machine guns, making the plane virtually impenetrable to enemy fighters. The landing gear was traceable and highly reinforced, designed to operate not only on paved runways, but also on the improvised coral and dirt runways that would become common on the Pacific Islands. This was a theoretical advantage over the B-29, which was more sensitive to poor quality runways. And of course, the pressurized cabin. Like the B-29, the B-32 was designed to keep its crew of up to 10 men comfortable and safe at extreme altitudes, avoiding the need for heavy oxygen masks and heated flight suits for most of the mission. In the drawings and on the drawing boards, the B-32 Dominator seemed not only a worthy rival, but perhaps even superior in certain respects. It was supposed to be the Liberator on steroids. Simpler in some systems, more robust in its design. Consolidated was confident. They had delivered the B-24, an aircraft that, while less glamorous than the B-17, was produced in greater numbers and proved a tireless workhorse in all theaters of operation. They believed they could do it again and faster than Boeing. But aviation, especially in wartime, is a cruel mistress. And the gap between the promise on paper and the harsh reality of metal and air was about to prove an unbridgeable chasm. The first XB-32 prototype, serial number 41411, was finally ready for its maiden flight on September 7, 1942, just 2 months before the first flight of the B-29 prototype. The race was on. But from the moment the Consolidated giant left the ground, problems began to arise. The first major nightmare was the engines. The Wright R-3350s were an engineering marvel, but they were temperamental and prone to overheating and fires. It was a problem that also plagued the B-29, but in the B-32, it seemed chronic. Oil leaks were constant, and the engine cowlings, designed to be aerodynamic, restricted airflow, exacerbating overheating. Then came the technological disaster of pressurization. The system simply didn't work. It leaked constantly, was unable to maintain the necessary pressure, and became a maintenance nightmare. Engineers struggled but were never able to solve the problem satisfactorily. The promise of low-stress, high-altitude flight turned into a massive dead weight loss. This failure had a devastating ripple effect. Without pressurization, the remote defensive turrets, which relied on pressurized gun points, had to be abandoned. Consolidated engineers had to go back to the drawing board and hastily redesign the defensive system, adopting manually operated turrets similar to those on the B-17 and B-24. This was not only a technological setback, it added weight and complexity to the structure, requiring openings in the fuselage that compromised aerodynamics. Meanwhile, flight tests revealed more flaws. The twin tail, inherited from the B-24, caused instability and control problems. The plane was heavy and slow to respond to commands. In a tragic accident on May 10, 1943, the second prototype crashed during a test flight, killing the entire crew. The investigation revealed structural flaws. Consolidated, in desperation, took a drastic decision. They completely redesigned the aircraft's tail, replacing the twin-fin design with a single, gigantic vertical stabilizer, much like the B-29's. The change worked, dramatically improving the plane's stability. But it cost precious time. Time Boeing was using to refine its B-29. While the Dominator was mired in an endless cycle of problems, redesigns, and delays, the B-29, despite its own severe difficulties, especially with the same R-3350 engines, was moving forward. The B-29 program was a national priority. It received the best engineers, the most abundant resources, and the direct attention of General Arnold. It was the billion-dollar project, and the U.S. government was not going to let it fail. With each passing month, the insurance policy the B-32 represented seemed less necessary. The B-29 was already in mass production. Its crews were being trained, bases in the Mariana Islands were being built specifically to accommodate it. The juggernaut of the American war machine had chosen its champion. The B-32, with its chronic problems and slow production, was becoming irrelevant before it had even fired a single shot in combat. The decision to abandon pressurization was the final nail in the coffin of its technological superiority. It became essentially a conventional bomber, capable of high flight, but without its defining advantage. It was always a step, or rather a full year, behind its rival. By mid-1945, the war in the Pacific was reaching its bloody climax. The B-29 had already incinerated dozens of Japanese cities in devastating incendiary raids. The need for a second super bomber had all but disappeared. However, the B-32 production line, though slow, was already underway, and the Army decided it needed to somehow evaluate the aircraft under real combat conditions. Thus, almost discreetly, the first B-32 Dominator units were sent to the Pacific Theater of Operations. In May 1945, 3 aircraft were assigned to the 312th Bombardment Group, based in Luzon, Philippines. Their initial mission was not bombing, but combat evaluation, essentially flying secondary missions to see how the aircraft performed. The B-32, now depressurized and equipped with manual turrets, was a different machine than originally designed. But in the air, it showed some qualities. The pilots reported that it was surprisingly agile for its size and easier to land than the B-29, thanks to its robust Davis wing and heavy-duty landing gear. Its first missions were against targets in Formosa, present-day Taiwan, and the Chinese coast. These were conventional bombing missions, and the Dominator performed reasonably well. But its moment in history was yet to come, and it would arrive not at the height of the war, but in its final, confused gasps. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the atomic bombs fell. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. But in the chaotic aftermath, not everyone received or accepted the memo. Isolated and fanatical Imperial Japanese Army and Navy units continued to fight, and the American Air Force continued to fly photo reconnaissance missions over Japan to monitor compliance with the surrender and ensure the safety of the occupying forces on their way. And it was for this dangerous mission that the B-32 was assigned. On August 17, 2 B-32s flew one of these missions over Tokyo. They were intercepted by Japanese fighters, but the attack was brief and inconsequential. It was a warning. The real drama unfolded the next day, August 18, 1945. 3 days after the announcement of the surrender, 4 B-32 Dominators from the 386th Bombardment Squadron took off on another reconnaissance mission over the Japanese capital. Flying at 20,000 feet, they were attacked by at least 14 Japanese fighters, including the agile A-6M-0 and the fast N-1K George. The Japanese pilots were veterans, aces who refused to accept the end of the war. They attacked with desperate fury. The Dominator's .50 caliber machine guns responded, and the skies over Tokyo filled with tracers. The battle was intense. A B-32, named Hobo Queen II, was seriously damaged. One of its engines was hit and caught fire, and the fuselage was pierced by 20mm shells. Sergeant Anthony Marchione, one of the photographers on board, was mortally wounded, becoming the last American aerial combat casualty of World War II. Despite the severe damage, the crew of the Hobo Queen II managed to extinguish the engine fire and return the plane to base in Okinawa. Another B-32 was also damaged, but all returned. They had survived the last major aerial engagement of World War II. The B-32, the Dominator, the plane that arrived too late for the war, had etched its name in history, not as a decisive victor, but as the protagonist of the conflict's final act of violence. A somber and melancholy honor. The story of the B-32 Dominator is a perfect storm of factors. There was no single reason for its failure, but a cascade of technical problems, strategic decisions, and above all, poor timing. Let's dissect the reasons. First, and most crucial, the superiority and primacy of the B-29. The Superfortress, despite its own development hell, crossed the finish line first. While the B-32 was still struggling with basic design flaws in 1943 and 1944, the B-29 was already in mass production. The entire logistics of the war in the Pacific, crew training, base construction, the supply chain, was shaped around the B-29. Switching to a new aircraft in the middle of the final war effort would have been a logistical and financial nightmare. The generals already had their proven weapon, the weapon that was effectively burning Japan into submission. Why take a chance with a new platform that was still, in many ways, an unknown? Second, were the chronic and intractable problems of the B-32 itself. The catastrophic failure of the pressurization system was the fatal blow. It eliminated the Dominator's main technological advantage over the B-29. Without it, it was forced to regress to previous generation defensive technology, making it a potentially more vulnerable target. Add to this the persistent engine problems, production delays, and fatal accidents during the testing phase. The aircraft simply didn't inspire the same confidence as its rival. It was seen as a lemon, a doomed project. And third, the most relentless factor of all, the end of the war. Just as the B-32 finally became a minimally viable combat platform, the war ended. With Japan's surrender, the United States shifted from a production-at-any-cost mentality to massive budget cuts. Congress wanted to demobilize the military, bring the troops home, and curb exorbitant military spending. In this new scenario, maintaining 2 fleets of super bombers was an unsustainable luxury. The choice was obvious. Stick with the B-29, of which nearly 4,000 units had been built, a tested, proven aircraft already integrated into the entire Air Force structure, or stick with the B-32, of which just over 100 units had been delivered, an aircraft with a troubled development history that no longer offered any significant advantage. The B-32 wasn't defeated by the Zero fighters, it was defeated by the pen of a Pentagon accountant. It was born for a war that ended before it could prove its worth. It was born too late. The order to end the war came swiftly and unceremoniously. On September 8, 1945, just 6 days after the formal signing of the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri, production of the B-32 was canceled. By October, the entire program was shut down. The fate of the aircraft already built was even more brutal. Of the 118 units produced, including prototypes, the vast majority had a ridiculously short service life. Many of them flew directly from the assembly line in Fort Worth, Texas, to the plane graveyards in the Arizona and Arkansas deserts. Imagine the scene. Brand new bombers smelling of fresh paint with very few flight hours, lined up under the blazing sun, waiting for the axe. They had seen no combat, had no stories to tell. They were merely war surplus. Unlike thousands of B-17s, B-24s, and even B-29s, which were preserved for museums or sold for civilian use as freighters or transport aircraft firefighting, the B-32 was no such luck. Its limited production and rapid obsolescence made it unattractive. The order was clear: dismantle. The metal giants were systematically dismantled, their engines removed, their instruments cannibalized, and their fuselages cut and melted down. The aluminum that was supposed to fly over Tokyo was transformed into pots, cars, and other products for a nation returning to peace. The process was so rapid and so thorough that today the result is shocking. Not a single complete B-32 Dominator exists in the entire world. Not one. The plane that was supposed to succeed the B-29 simply evaporated. What remains are fragments. The cockpit of one of the prototypes, the XB-32 the First, was recovered and is on display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. It is a solitary relic. Pieces of one of the planes that crashed in combat, the Hobo Queen II, were located in Japan. And there are photos, technical manuals, and the faded memories of the few men who flew it. The B-32 became the largest mass-produced aircraft in American aviation history without a single surviving example. A true historical ghost. A footnote so small that most history books don't even bother to mention it.
What can we learn from the story of the B-32 Dominator? What does this forgotten colossus teach us about war, technology, and memory? The first lesson is brutally pragmatic. In war, and perhaps in any great human endeavor, good enough, right on time, almost always trumps perfect too late. The B-29 was a flawed aircraft, dangerous to its own crews at first, but it was there, it was available, and it was decisive. The B-32, even if it had overcome all its problems and become a superior machine, simply missed its window of opportunity. History does not wait for laggards. The second lesson is about the nature of innovation. The B-32 shows us that engineering does not exist in a vacuum. It is governed by political decisions, budgets, logistics, and the human factor. The success of a military project depends not only on its technical merits, but on its ability to integrate into a larger strategy. The B-29 became the centerpiece of American strategy in the Pacific. The B-32 was just one appendix, a Plan B that, fortunately, was never needed. And finally, the B-32 teaches us about the fragility of historical memory. We celebrate the icons, the victors, the Spitfire, the Mustang, the B-17, the B-29. They become legends. But behind each of these legends, there are dozens of projects like the B-32. Aircraft brimming with potential, flown by brave men who, by a twist of fate, ended up in the dustbin of history. The B-32 Dominator never had the chance to dominate anything, but its story forces us to look at the shadows, at the what-ifs that populate the past. It reminds us that behind every celebrated victory, behind every triumphal parade, there are always machines, projects, and men who also served, fought, and who, in the end, were simply forgotten.
The consolidated B-32 Dominator is living, breathing proof that not all metal giants born from the fires of war are destined for glory. It was conceived to be the next step in the evolution of air power, the heir to the throne occupied by the B-29. Instead, it became one of the most melancholy epilogues of World War II. It flew its last missions, fought its last battle, and its crews gave the ultimate sacrifice. But none of this was enough to save it from obscurity. It is the successor that never was, an aluminum titan swallowed by time, a ghost in the Pacific skies, and a powerful, silent reminder that history is often written not by the best, nor by the strongest, but simply by those who arrived at the right time.